6,000, something like this, 240,000 gigawatt hours of energy.
Wait, we haven't said what a gigawatt is.
So that's 1,000 megawatts.
1,000 megawatts.
Right. And a megawatt, 1 megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. So as an example, if you look at your electricity bill, they have a thing called a kWh, which is kilowatt hour.
Right.
So a kilowatt hour is the total amount of kilowatts used over the period of a day. Now, in Eskom's case, it is the period of a day, but it can also be if you burn whatever. So if you take 5 kilowatts, you burn it for whatever, 1 hour, it's a 5 kilowatt hour. It's the total amount of energy used within a time frame, a period.
Right.
But the way that it's reflected on your bill is reflected generally for your daily consumption. It's normally averaged.
Right.
So at the end of a month, they will say you've used 486 kilowatt hours. That's your total usage of energy or electricity.
You build for kilowatt hours.
You're building kilowatt hours.
All over the world.
Right. So now what you would normally do, and I'm going to use easy numbers. Okay. So let's say for argument's sake, your bill at the end of the month is for 300 kilowatt hours. You are then charged normally on what's called a tariff rate, which is normally like whatever, R1.50, R1.80 per kilowatt hour.
Right.
So they would take that, whatever the figure is, depending if you're prepaid or whatever tariff code you're on, and they multiply it by your usage, which is the 300 kilowatt hours. And that's how they determine what your electricity cost is.
Right.
On top of that, they generally would add some other services, line lease costs, that kind of stuff. They would add that, but what we're referring to here is electricity costs.
Now, there is about something like, is it 8,000 hours in a year, or something like that.
Okay.
So if you have an installation that puts out 10 megawatts, does that mean it can put out 10 megawatts times 8,000 hours in a year?
Right, so you get viable output. A 10, for instance, a 10 megawatt, or let's use something smaller, a 10 kilowatt or whatever, any size of solar array.
Right.
It will have what we call peak generation, which is over your primary arc in terms of sunlight. Generally, the rule is 15% before those hours, 15% after those hours. Is not full production.
Right.
So to get slightly more technical, a solar panel is rated by something called a STC, which is a standard test condition.
Okay.
And what that means is if you have a 250 watt solar panel, what they do is they lay it over a sunbed, and that sunbed puts out 1,000 watts per square meter. And based on the impact of that sunlight, the amount of electricity it generates, they rate that solar panel. Now, to come back to your question, if you put one of those solar panels at a good position, at a good angle, up onto your roof, and you leave it for the day, in the early morning, say between 8 and whatever, 10 o'clock, you're not going to get full generation.
Right.
So that solar panel, even though it's a 250 watt solar panel, it's not going to produce 250 watts.
Okay.
Because the incidence of the sunlight on the solar panel is not direct. So it will underproduce. It will maybe do whatever, 180 watts or all the way down to zero.
So when you get just to kind of...
So to come back to your original question, inside of a day, we as renewable energy people, we take what's called an engineering norm, which is we always work with 5.5 hours.
So when we've got a 250 watt solar panel, that is what it does at the peak of sunlight. But it might be less at different times of the day.
Correct, yeah.
But to return that to our original question about kilowatt hours per year, and the relationship between a certain installation and the number of kilowatt hours.
Right.
So kilowatts to kilowatt hours. People want to understand what's the difference. How does that work?
Right. So when they talk about 100 megawatts, it's what we call about 100 megawatts deployed, meaning that they'll put up. So put it in easier terms, but they'll put up 100 megawatts of solar panels on the ground.
Right.
They're not telling you how much it's going to produce for the day. They're not saying. So the expectation generally would be is that you should pick up 550 megawatts or half a gigawatt of output from a 100 megawatt plant. So there's a difference.
Numbers again. We've got 100 megawatt.
So we've got 100. We work on a standard saying that even though the sun comes up in its daytime for you,
right,
from whatever 7 in the morning, and at 7 at night it goes down, and that's right, 12 hours. We don't calculate based on 12 hours. In areas like Dar and these kind of areas, you can calculate on 6 hours or 6.5 hours or whatever. But what I'm trying to say is that we always calculate on a minimum standard, which is normally 5.5 hours.
Okay.
So when I design a 100 megawatt array, my expectation is for it to work for 5.5 hours of the day at full production.
And that would be how many kilowatt hours then?
So if you had 100 megawatts that was producing at 5.5 hours, you'd have 550 megawatts.
Right, okay, got it.
But that, because there's 1,000 megawatts in a gigawatt, it's the same thing as saying it's just over half a gigawatt.
Right.
And but that's production. So but what they're talking about in the newspaper, which is why we're having this discussion, is they're talking about 100 megawatt plant, and what that means is 100 megawatts deployed.
Right.
So on the ground, if it's 10 solar panel, 10 or whatever, if it's 4 250 watt solar panels, that's a kilowatt deployed.
Okay.
If it's whatever, it's what you put on the ground, and there's nothing to do with how much power it makes. Now, what the minister was referring to, and what NERSA was referring to in that article, was they were saying that we have been bound by a power purchase agreement, which is what the IPP is. It's the power purchase, but it's power purchase agreement, PPA. And what it is they are bound at a certain rate. So a developer comes to the minister, says, "Hello, minister, I'm responding to your bid, and we're going to put out this bid, and we're going to offer you electricity at R1.05
right,
per kilowatt hour,
right,
or per whatever, we were R2.80 per kilowatt, whatever their value is."
Right.
So they are basically selling electricity to Eskom. Eskom then signs an agreement saying, "I accept that, and I will utilize that, and I can on-sell that."
Okay. And on the production of that electricity, if it was nuclear or if it was coal, how would the whole kilowatt hour thing work with the...
Right, so they do exactly the same thing. So you don't judge okay, so first of all nuclear, coal, petroleum, natural gas, all of them, they all use steam turbines. Those turbines have a rating, either, whatever, they're 550 megawatts or 500 megawatts. That's their rating, that is their deployed. Medupi is rated at 4,700 megawatts. It means that they have turbines in there that are rated at 4,700 megawatts. So when you switch it on, that will produce 4,700 megawatts every hour. Every hour it will produce it. So over the course of a day, obviously it's a massive amount of power, massive amount of energy there. But the reality is that if you take a look at Medupi, so Medupi was initially intended to cost 5.4 billion rand in this case.
Okay.
Actually, I think I converted to US dollars, but anyway, so it meant to cost 5.4. I think it's billion US dollars for the construction. It's the largest coal-fired power station in the world. Once it's completed, it will be.
Okay.
However, after 2 years, they said no, they were unable to complete it. There was issues with it, and the costs went up.
Okay.
Now they're sitting on, it's almost year 10. They still haven't completed the plant. It's still not fully functional. It's almost doubled in cost in terms of what they originally stated it was going to cost.
Okay.
Now that is not always the norm with coal fire. Coal fire is not as inaccurate as that traditionally.
Right.
But there is a technology that is, forever comes in over cost, over budget, over time.
Like the French one in the UK.
Yeah. So the same story. Alone, originally, to meet the cost of production for a nuclear plant is inevitably going to overrun all budgets. And it scares people, it scares countries. If you're signing up a deal for 1.4 billion euro and to produce it, in the back of your head, you've got to be starting to worry about, hang on, this could actually cost us 2.4, 3.4, whatever it is, you know,
yeah.
100 billion euro, whatever, you know, it's the same figure. In your mind, you know that that is not a persistent figure.
Right.
And so there's problems with it. And then aside from the problems with it, a lot of countries in Europe, they export the nuclear waste. Ironically, this country, South Africa, was picked up as importing. We're registered as an importer of nuclear waste. God knows what we do with it.
I wonder.
But that nuclear waste goes somewhere, you know.
Wahlplatz.
Sorry?
Wahlplatz.
Okay, so there you go. But I mean, and that's just from one nuclear facility or a group of nuclear facilities in single place, and we're importing it here. But all over the world, there is byproduct. In Coburg buries on site. So that means that even long after Coburg has ceased to operate, that ground will have nuclear waste.
Okay.
But nuclear waste is not actually the big problem, so much the big problem. I mean, nuclear waste is never nice, no matter what you do. But there's other problems. So you know, nuclear has to desalinate the water and to you know.
Before we go into the other problems,
Right.
just on the kilowatt hour thing, how long? You know, it's 5.5 hours on average for solar per day. For a coal-fired reactor.
No, so they run 24 hours.
They run 24
yeah,
hours.
Well, I mean, they're load dependent, so they're demand side dependent.
Okay, because sometimes they disengage for a while. We've heard about that.
Yes, so that's called wheeling. So what happens is when you have, so if you're powering any demand, so any kind of load, at any given point during the time of the day or time of the year, the demand may be higher. So let's say we're powering this house for argument's sake. In the morning, we're all making breakfast in the kitchen, and our demand is maybe 5 kilowatt, you know, whatever it is.
Right.
But then during the day, everyone goes to school and goes to work, and the demand drops right off. Now it's whatever, half a kilowatt. It's just powering your fridge and a bunch of other stuff that you left on. Right. But then you come home at night, and everyone's home. They're using their geysers, and but the exact same thing that happens with this house can be, you know, extrapolated on a macro scale for a city, for a province, for anything.
So everybody does the same things roughly at the
right,
same
but
time.
it makes a variation, so it makes a pattern. So what happens is you know, any power plant, whether it's coal fire or nuclear or anything, they have to gear up to supply demand. But there can be a gap, and that gap can be short. It can be anything from hours up to, you know, a few minutes, but there are drop-offs. Now, you can't have a turbine that's producing all this power, and that power goes nowhere.
Right.
So what they do is they disengage it, and it goes into a state called wheeling. So they're still turning the turbine, but it's just not producing power.
Okay, and for nuclear, do they do that too?
It's the exact same concept. Yeah.
So
in
they
fact,
put the rods
nuclear,
in to stop
nuclear, you don't switch off. So you can't really. One of the big problems with nuclear, in fact, this is the big problem that they have in Japan with Fukushima, is that once you've got your heat, once the production, once the chain reaction has started, there's no switch, man. You can't walk up to a nuclear plant and go, okay, off now. Right. You know, it doesn't work like that. It's a savage beast. You're splitting an atom.
Right.
So anyway, net result is they have exactly the same principle. It goes into a state of wheeling. They disengage the actual production. The power is still being put into the actual turbine, but they've disengaged the production.
Okay, so they don't stop the reactor. They don't put the rods down like they would do.
No. If they're going into a state of maintenance, then obviously they will cut the output. But at the end of the day, I want you to put it in perspective. And there is really no difference. The reason why nuclear is because it takes less to make that much more heat. You're using a more advanced, you're splitting an atom, which is what's releasing that massive amounts of energy inside of that atom to basically flash boil water. I mean, that's what you're doing. You flash boiling water. It's like, woo.
Yes.
But in coal, it's not different, really.
Right.
But you've got to keep that temperature at some constant. You can't walk in there and spray it down with a hose to switch it off.
Right.
Yeah, you can taper it off, and slowly cool it down. But even if you were to shut them down today, like coal fire, it would take weeks to actually cool down to a point that it's functional.
A coal fire.
A coal fire. Forget nuclear. I mean, nuclear, coal fire, petroleum. It's all the same thing. It's all the same principle.
Right.
It's operating on a heat basis, and the heat is what is evaporating steam, and that steam is driven into a turbine, and turns the wheel, and that's what generates. And the thing that I always find the funniest about this whole thing is that you can understand the basic principle of coal. You heat something up, and you're using the steam to turn a wheel. And you know, that's sort of sensical. But when you start splitting atoms,
right?
You know, I mean, it's like one of the most powerful reactions in the universe almost. I mean, it's immensely powerful. I mean, outside of fission, it's huge.
Yeah.
And you're using it to boil water. You know, it's the concept is crazy. It's crazy. And when accidents happen, they happen. And I mean, if you think about it in our lifetime, we're already aware of 2 accidents. You've got Chernobyl, you've got Fukushima. There are countless, I didn't even know about that. But I mean, there's countless other incidents that happen. But coming back to a nuclear reactor, for argument's sake, they all have a byproduct. So they flush out. There's a huge outflow of hot water. Now, because most of that comes from the sea and they don't really care, they just dump it into the sea. It goes back into the ocean.
Right.
And that's why the water is always generally warmer around nuclear reactors.
Right.
But of course, it has a dramatic impact on all the entire marine ecosystem that's around a nuclear plant. I mean, it is devastating.
Okay.
So everything changes, everything shifts, you know, and so that's another byproduct that you have from nuclear. I mean, it's not as bad, obviously, as nuclear waste, but it's right up there. It has a traumatic impact.
Now, you've been very involved in the new storage technologies that are coming on stream. Why? How will that affect this concept of wheeling and disengaging from
right? So I mean, it's like beautiful. It's really beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. There's actually a couple of ways to conquer what we load problem. The base load problem is you have solar power and it's up in the day, but at night there's no solar power. So what happens, you know? And that's the base load problem. And the same with the wind turbine. You've got all these wind turbines all around the country producing wind power, but there are times when there's no wind. So what happens?
Even in Cape Town,
right? Well, very rare. Yeah. at heights, yeah. But anyway, it's a problem. Okay, so there's a couple of technologies that stepped into the gap. One of these technologies is renewables called CSP, or concentrated solar power, and they use a type of salt and they go through what's called a phase change, and they store the output. So they have all these mirrors, concentrate on another name for it is a power tower, but they concentrate on a point of light and it melts the salt and it basically stores the heat. Right. And they can utilize that heat for overnight or days at a time. But the principle of storing energy as heat is there.
Right.
And of course it's well over-engineered. I mean, seriously over-engineered. You can buy this stuff. It's Israeli technology. The storage technology is Israeli. The Israelis are very good at this kind of stuff.
Okay.
But so if you understand that here we've got these really advanced concepts that people that are trying to confuse you, they throw at you. Okay. You know, like they'll talk about things like, how do you store 50 megawatt? What is the base load? And they'll throw concepts at you
That's why we need you, Jason.
No. But I mean, it's not just me. It's not just me.
Yes.
As complex as they try to make it sound, it actually comes down to a very basic mechanic.
Right.
You know, like you heating up something, and then you putting water through the thing, and the water boils. It boils, and then you understand? And it runs a turbine. It's the exact
mechanical energy.
Exactly right, and the same principle. And another thing that I also love, I must just say this, is that in most of us, when I was growing up, we did an experiment where we took magnets and we put it around a piece of copper, and you make a little bulb go on. And it's kind of ironic that we're using the exact same thing. I mean, those big nuclear turbines, those big coal fire, those advanced, those heavy engineers, and it's serious stuff, mainly because of the output of it.
Sure.
But I mean, it is that same basic principle. It's that basic thing of magnet round copper. You know, that's and more advanced versions. But I mean, that's what it is. So anyway, there you get heat as a storage mechanism.
Okay.
And that's nice because they can utilize that. But there are actually cheaper ways to do it. You know, they've come up with the mixture. What they've got is like there's various different salts that they can apply to that. But you know, you could actually do something simple.
Right.
You could do like sand. You could do like concrete.
Right.
Concrete actually has a higher storage the amount of heat that it can take, the amount of heat that it can retain it actually can retain it as long without having to undergo a phase change as the salt.
Right.
I mean, but we've so over-engineered the whole concept of it.
Concrete's not so romantic.
No. Like if you said this, oh, hey, no, we're going to make a big hole here, we're going to fill it with concrete, and then we're going to output, and we're going to heat up the concrete so it's really hot, and then that's our storage mechanism. I mean, no, you can't, you're not going to get a BMW like that, know, because anybody can do it. So that's on the one thing, and obviously I'm oversimplifying to an extent, but then you get super advances in technology, and this is what's just happened recently, is supercapacitors. And supercapacitor is like a beautiful thing. Inside of every kind of device there's a thing called a capacitor, and the capacitor stores energy for a short period of time.
In our laptops, in our phones.
Laptops, in most devices, so anything that you've got any retained current. So like when you most people have had this advice before.
Right.
So when they're having a problem with an electronic device, they say unplug it,
yes,
and then leave it off for like 10 seconds.
And everybody wonders why.
Like why? Like why? Like, why must I do this?
Why can't we just put it on after 1 second? Because we're impatient people. You know?
And it's just allowing inverters and that kind of stuff. Anyway, they're a useful thing, and for a long time it's been rumored that the ability, the disadvantage that you always had with capacitors was you could never keep the current that you put in it, and of course the volume of storage that was available on any capacitor.
So capacitors discharge the current very quickly.
So they take current really quickly, and they discharge current really quickly.
Which is the characteristics of a capacitor as far as we knew so far. And that's what capacitors did, and that's how engineers used them. But something's changed now, right?
Yes, right. So now they basically went and they did carbon nanotube technology, and they applied it to these supercapacitors. And basically what they've been able to do is they've been able to take a capacitor, and they've been able to increase, first of all, the volume and amount of energy that it could take. Now, a capacitor, various different sizes of capacitor, could always take a lot of energy, but they were never able to keep it for a long time. So now you can keep the energy on a supercapacitor from anything between 1 kilowatt hour, 50 megawatt, you're able to keep for up to 14 days.
Right.
And that's seriously
14 days instead of 10 seconds.
Instead of even less than 10 seconds in some cases, but yes. So all of a sudden now you have a device that people would have loved to, for many years, everybody wanted to use a supercapacitor for some storage. Right. But the ability to, it just was too fast, it was too transient. You couldn't make it stay, no matter what you did. You couldn't keep the power there long enough.
So a capacitor now is more like what we would previously call a battery.
Yes, right. So that's what we call them now. We call them supercapacitor batteries.
Right. But the traditional batteries have disadvantages that capacitors don't have.
Of course, yes.
What are they?
So with any battery you have a thing called an electrolyte. Electrolyte is like the medium, the gel, or the lead acid that they use.
Lithium?
Lithium as well, although lithium is slightly in a different class to your typical store types of energy. But the negative components that are associated with this is that there's generally a build-up. So on the plate, so in the terms of when you recharge and discharge, and over time, the battery, it ceases to be able to absorb charge as well. And it ceases to be able to give up charge as well.
Can you clean them? Can you improve them?
You can, in some cases, you can. But if you understand that, you can get a maximum lifespan out of, any kind of plate. The buildup is so intense. I mean, it punches little holes in it. It's finished after a period of time.
As we know from our cell phones and our laptop.
Well, in that case, that's a lithium. So in that case, generally there's swelling on it, and the efficiency, so the overall ability for it to store power and release power, that becomes compromised over time.
Right.
The benefit that people have, for argument's sake, is that its energy density is is much higher. So
compared to, say, a car battery.
Yeah, much more.
Much more.
But also it has the benefit that you're able to cycle it a lot deeper. So you're able to use more of a lithium battery than you are, for argument's sake.
Cycle it deeper?
Cycle. So every battery is rated on the number of cycles.
Recharge.
Right, so it's a full discharge normally.
Right.
And you rate a battery, every battery has a thing called a DOD, which is a depth of depletion, versus cycle life characteristics.
Right.
And this is how we assess generally a battery.
Right.
And so you will see it will have, if you use, so if you've got a 100 amp battery for argument's sake and you use 50%, that's called a 50% DOD, depth of depletion, means you're using half of the battery. And if you cycle that on a daily basis, it will tell you how many cycles, how many cycles you can get off that. Maybe you can get 1,000 cycles, maybe you can get 500 cycles.
Right.
But a cycle is, generally you can use it in a year or whatever. You'll use up a little lead acid battery or 2 years.
Well, like a car battery.
Or like car battery. So a car battery, because you're not using the full volume of a car batteries last longer.
Ah.
But under renewable energy applications, you're using that battery generally on a day-to-day basis.
So you fully deplete it?
Well, not fully, never fully, but down to half or 30%.
Okay.
And then you're putting it back up, and half and 30%. You could fully deplete it, but then, so the more you deplete it, the shorter the lifespan of the battery.
Okay.
So people generally try what we call shallow cycle. You impact as low on the battery as possible.
Okay.
To get the maximum possible lifespan of the battery. And this is true of all technologies, whether it's lead acid, whether it's gel, AGM, lithium, it makes no difference.
Right.
That applies to those concepts because obviously there's a mechanical process.
Okay, the trees here, we collect the seeds in the rivers, mainly along the Berg River where the Berg River is so polluted. And we start right up at source at Assegai-Bos, collecting seeds of the indigenous breeder crew of yellowwoods and all the other indigenous plants and bushes and grasses and things that filter the water. And we did 16,500 trees last year, over 14,500 this year. We've got another probably 7,000